indigenous culture was wiped out, essentially, during the colonial era by an energy and industrial regime that was able to then colonize, by controlling the energies of the world, colonize people, colonize commodities, colonize land and landscape, all right? So that everyone's beholden to an energy regime and the victims of it. The best beneficiaries of a third industrial revolution are going to be the developing countries, because all the energies I'm talking about are everywhere. They're everywhere. And they are ample in the southern hemisphere. The sun shines, the wind blows, the geothermal heat. Once power can be harnessed locally and then can be shared regionally and over continents, it changes the nation of power from vertical to lateral and scales in a completely different way. The reason people are powerless today is literal. They have no power. 25% of the human race has never had electricity. Another 20% of the human race has only spotty access. They are not in the game. And so if we're going to liberate the human race, we've got to bring electricity to the human race. We know in Africa, with the microcredit that's spreading across Africa, that when you can get simply a solar cell on your roof, and you can have light, and you can have a little electricity, and you can have a little power, it liberates women all over the developing world from being the beasts of burden, because they are the energy mules, if you will, of this civilization. So wherever we see electricity that's controlled locally, we see the liberation of women, which is going to be very essential to moving us into the kind of era we're all talking about here. So what I would say is, as we flatten our sense of power, literally and figuratively, it's going to mean we're all indigenous. We all live where we are. We become biosphere nodes. We connect up our biosphere to biosphere to biosphere, and we are responsible for our part of the biosphere, but we collaborate for the entire biosphere by our interconnectivity. So I would say this: we don't over-romanticize the past. We don't go back to the past. But what every indigenous culture wants is to be part of the future and to share their cultural gifts and to share their knowledge and to be able to use this also to move forward to the next stage of the human journey. So our mission now, with 600 million indigenous people, we really should think about 6.8 billion indigenous people responsible in each locality for the earth we live in. And I think that's what indigenous cultures are trying to tell us. That's the mission they have in the educational function. So I understand when you say the school systems need to be recalibrated. It's funny, when I did the new book, the biggest chapter is on rethinking education. A lot of my friends said, well, why are you spending time on that? It's critical to create the consciousness for this new age. So I would say, indigenous cultures, take the gifts that you have, share it with the world, then begin to see how that'll reshape not only the world story, but your story, so we can live together as a single family in all of our diversity. I was saying in the talk, the problem is that if you know the energy regime of a civilization, you know pretty much how the power is going to be distributed, both literally and figuratively. Whether it's a forage or hunter society, traditional cultures, hydraulic civilization, or in this case, the first and second industrial revolution. The name of the game was elite energies, centralized controls, big global companies, the economies of scale were vertical. Everything became big. And the proof in the pudding is the 3 of the 6 largest companies in the world today are still energy companies. And then if you go down the pyramid, the rest are all related in some way to how that energy is then administered across the global economy. The third industrial revolution is really a revolution. It's lateral power. It's power to the people. It's we create our power. And through cooperatives and other arrangements, we, on a flat lateral plane, share our power across continents and across the biosphere. It creates new business models. For example, and you're already starting to see them on the internet, little companies like Etsy, all of a sudden competing against the big manufacturers, where they can now on their website connect up thousands of small craftspeople with millions of buyers and connect them in a more intimate relationship, which is completely distributed and collaborative. Or the nonprofit car sharing networks around the world, where people are now sharing their transport with each other instead of relying on big global operations to do it. We're beginning to see this in a whole range of areas. I have a new book coming out in September called The Third Industrial Revolution. One of the big sections of the book is rethinking the way we engage in commerce and trade. How do we go to a distributed model that's more network than market, and that's more commons than proprietary, and that's more open than closed. And also in the book there's a whole chapter on rethinking economic theory. our economic theory based on the Enlightenment is completely toxic, dysfunctional, and it makes no sense. And so what we need to do is rethink economic theory based on the laws of energy, ecosystem dynamics, and begin to chart a whole new course that will affect the way we conduct business. And finally, we have to rethink what the good life is. I remember Jonathan Rowe just passed away, and Herman Daly was an old colleague of mine when they first came up with an alternative index to GDP. But we've been relying on GDP to determine our economic priorities since the 30s, and that's just about output, output, output. So if you have more crime, more violence, more prisons, more weapons, that's all GDP. And when Jonathan Rowe and Herman Daly back 15 years ago said, let's have new indicators, quality of life, longevity, good health, safe environments, good water, safe communities. And now the European Union's now moving toward developing quality of life indicators. France has done it. The UK is starting it. The OECD just did it. These are positive signs. So I believe that the world that I'm talking about in 2050 is going to be very different from the kind of centralized, market-oriented, top-down proposition we had in the first and second industrial revolution. But we have to be vigilant. This is power to the people, but there will be energy interests that would like to absorb it, take it, grab it, and control it. So this is a big mission. And I will say this, if we can create distributed power, that's going to affect politics and governance in a very, very fundamental way. Last thought. The kids that I see, the young adults, I shouldn't say kids, but I'm so old, young people, these young adults in 1920, their politics is very different than ours. What I've noticed in this shift to a third industrial revolution, sometimes you never know who the political body or governing jurisdiction is that wants to do this. And the reason is we still think right-left. We still think ideological politics, socialism, capitalism, etc. No one in 20 years old even thinks about this. It's not even on their radar screen because their spectrum has already shifted to the new model I'm talking about. When they judge political behavior, economic behavior, social behavior, and cultural behavior, their spectrum's not right-left. It's the following. Is this behavior centralized, patriarchal, top-down, proprietary, and closed? Or is this behavior institutional, personal, or cultural? Is it distributed, collaborative, open source, and on the commons? That's the new politics. That's distributed, collaborative politics. So I think it's an uphill battle. I'm mindful of the challenges we face, and I also believe that power doesn't like to give up easily. On the other hand, history is not on the side of these old institutional bodies. But that doesn't mean we're going to seize history. That depends on whether or not we've got the resolve to do it. Just because good ideas come along doesn't mean they're going to happen. There's a lot of history littered with good ideas that never saw the light of day. And there are a lot of dark periods in history where we've gone back centuries before we go forward again. So I think the question in my mind, can this current generation and the next three move to change the entire model and create bios for conscience? It's going to be a struggle. But there's no plan B. This is the only plan that I know of. If there's a plan B, I haven't heard of it. We brought together in Europe the environmental community, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the consumer federations, the cooperatives. Now, those are pretty distributed, but they're still not the local community, but they represent them across Europe. We found that the only way to implement a third industrial revolution is it has to be buy-in each biosphere, each area by the three sectors, government, business, and civil society, all at the table. So, for example, and all of our master plans are available. They're open. You can go to the Utrecht master plan. That was done with the three parties at the table. They have an open website in which everyone is participating every day in how to fill out the plan so that they can actually have a unified third industrial revolution plan for their whole region. That's really not top-down. It's bottom-bottom. But yes, there are companies involved. There are industries like IBM and Philips and Cisco. Yes, they're involved because they have technical expertise. The key here is who controls the power. That's why we brought the World Cooperative Association into our group, ICA. It's all the cooperatives in the world, producing and consumer cooperatives. So when we roll out a plan like in Rome, the cooperatives are at the table, and when the citizens of Rome put together their power, it's all going to be through neighborhood cooperatives, SME cooperatives, producer and consumer cooperatives, so it's controlled laterally. Controlled laterally. That doesn't mean there won't be room for big businesses in there as service providers. But the key here is to make sure the power is all controlled in a community fashion, and that's what cooperatives can do. So the cooperative movement sees itself upgrading for the 21st century, not going back, but using its basic principles and values, like the indigenous culture, to move that model into a distributed, flat economic model. I think it's a challenge, as I keep saying, but I'm not sure what other way we want to approach this. I think what we want to have is 6.8 billion people who can have access to universal energy and create it where they are and share it with their friends and neighbors across the world. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Then we need to get on the task we're doing. The technology's there, but the mindset has to be there. Biosphere consciousness has to be there. The educational system has to be revamped, and we have to learn from each other. Indigenous cultures will play a very, very critical role in helping us understand that the primary, I would have to say that the primary sector has never been the market or government. That culture is where we create our narrative, it's where we create social trust, it's where we create our story. There's never an example in history where you first create markets, then create a culture, or first create governments, then create a culture. What indigenous cultures can tell us is that that is not the third sector, which is pejorative, and it's not the not-for-profit sector, which is a slur, meaning not profit, and it's not the non-governmental sector, non-GO, NGO, because that means a negative, non-government. It's like woman is a negative, not man, woe man. So what we have to do is understand from indigenous cultures that we are first and foremost a social creature. We are storytellers. We create community. We create larger fictional families. And our mission is to transcend ourselves in larger and larger, more integrated social wholes. And what indigenous culture can teach us is that our story begins with that, the narrative, the social trust, the bonds, the companionship that we create. And that's the gift that they can bring to the rest of this society, which has, for 200 or 300 years, been bereft of those kind of basic, fundamental principles of what a human being is. And it's those fundamental principles, I think, that's going to get us beyond this bad stretch, hopefully. What most people are surprised to learn is that 1/3 of all the food, the grain grown in the world today is feed grain for animals. It's almost 40%. And so that allows a handful of us in the very wealthy countries to live high up on the food chain, gorging ourselves with a high-protein meat diet, way beyond our protein needs. And the irony is we die of diseases of affluence like heart attacks, strokes, and diabetes. Our poor brothers and sisters have less access to the land for food grains, and they die of diseases of poverty. The FAO-UN says we're going to double our meat production and consumption in 30 years. That means 60% of all the arable land that's left is going to be feed grain for animals, 40% left for humans. So when someone asks me how are we going to feed the people, move down the food chain. Eat a more omnivore diet. That's the way to do it. And I think, secondly, this is not just a matter of going back to a romantic past. My global team just did the rollout plan for Rome. We just did an 18 billion euro plan to convert the city of Rome, the mayor of Rome, we're doing in other cities, to a third industrial revolution model. And we're re-envisioning cities as biosphere nodes. And in that, some of you have been to Rome, 60% of Rome is rural area that's unused. It just hasn't been used since the 6th century. So we are cutting a sheath through the rural, commercial, and historic areas of Rome. We joined up with the slow food movement and others. And if you go to Rome, hopefully in 20 years from now, you young people, that entire outer circle is going to be the Mediterranean diet, organic farms, eco-biological dynamic farming, arboretums, animal farm sanctuaries, so that we can show the world a better way to grow local, provide for local populations, and share surpluses with nodal regions that may be down the line. So this isn't just about going back to some romantic tradition. It is being able to take the best of the indigenous knowledge and culture. This is our heirloom. It's not just the germplasm. Our heirloom culture is the indigenous knowledge on how to preserve these foods, bring them into the 21st century, and begin to think regional food supplies. And that's going to be the name of the game. With energy costs going up, we cannot afford to bring your grape from Chile to Washington. Can't be done. And the margins are going to be energy costs for the next 30 years. So the practical business of business is grow regionally, rely on regional food sources, share those food sources across continental markets, and begin the process of creating a 21st century that's more in tune with biosphere dynamics. That just makes sense from a business and a cultural point of view. The industrial age, based on fossil fuels, ended slave labor writ large. As we move into this century, the new technologies, the smart technologies, are eliminating mass wage labor. So we're seeing a trend toward the elimination of these kinds of employments. Manufacturing, for example, it isn't the jobs that are leaving America, jobs are leaving the world. The Chinese eliminated 15% of its manufacturing workforce in the last 10 years, all replaced by intelligent technology, which is cheaper and more efficient than the cheapest worker. This is happening everywhere. We have a little silver lining. Although, as you know, in the end of work, I said we're moving toward a boutique professional workforce is engaged with very sophisticated intelligent technology. We have a 40-year period in which we can have one last spurt of mass wage labor. That's to build the infrastructure I laid out at this talk. Taking the infrastructure of the world and converting it to a 5-pillar third industrial revolution modality is hundreds of millions of jobs. We have to convert to the renewable energies. We have to convert every building in the world to a power plant. Pillar 3, we have to put in storage across the world. Pillar 4, we have to completely change the transformation of the power grid. Pillar 5, we have to recreate logistics and transport. And that's all local jobs for 2 generations. So we need to educate our young people on 2 parallel tracks. One, prepare them for the last spurt of industrial wage labor in the next 40 years. 2, prepare them for collaborative distributed work in the civil society, the not-for-profit sector. Because if we survive this, if we make it through to 2050, if we can get post-carbon, by 2050 you'll see the traditional marketplace with very small boutique workforces. Much of the employment, which is where it's going now, will be in the not-for-profit sector. And increasingly, that's where we create our social capital. Technology can't replace in that sector because it's all about human beings creating narrative and creating interactions with other human beings. So what I imagine in mid-century is that probably over half the population of the world will be in the not-for-profit sector, both freely given labor and fees for services and paid. And they will purchase quite a bit of their goods and services both in that sector and in the high-tech marketplace.